Welcome to chess, ladies and gentlemen. How's it going? Okay, so they've played 5 rounds of the Meltwater Opera Euro Champions Chess Tour, which is the 3rd tournament in the Champions Chess Tour. And just to show you guys the standings, let me see here. We have this is the standings here, and so you see Wesley So is in 2nd place, just behind Magnus Carlsen, who he did defeat in the 1st round. And so we have Magnus Carlsen leading with 4. Just take that away right quick. Bam. So we are good to go. Now, like I said before, I did change my chess legends to the great Maurice Ashley, first black grandmaster in history, U.S. Chess Hall of Famer. And it said something in his Wikipedia about him sharing a U.S. championship with Maxim Delugy. I'm not fully sure what that meant exactly. But if anybody out there knows, leave a comment, let me know. Maybe you can teach me something. Yeah, continuing with the shades like Wesley So did in his tournament. We have Wesley So versus Daniil Dubov. Like I said, it is round 3. And if you guys are ready, let's go ahead and get it rolling. Oh, you know what? Before I forget, on accident, hit the subscribe button for me. I almost so you guys see it as E4, but subscribe for me. Hit the subscribe button. I appreciate the support very much. Leave comments, concerns, anything you think I can do to make my channel better. Feel 100% free. But I appreciate the support. Meraming Salamat, Shukran, Merci beaucoup, Gracias. Thank you very much, guys out there. I'll say Vanakam to my 10 mil square people. So we got, okay, cool. So we have E4, we have C5. So we have the good old Sicilian, knight to F3. We have knight to C6. We have bishop to B5. So we have the Sicilian Rosalimo. Pretty popular opening. So we see E5, E6. We have castles for white, knight G to E7. We got D4, pawn takes D4, knight takes D4. Almost in all of the Sicilians that you see are going to have D4 striking out in the center, just to try to maximize the knight that you have on F3 and just break the position open. It's not the absolute best in the world to give up one of your center pawns for a wing pawn, but that is the entire goal of the Sicilian, to try to trade off a wing pawn for a center pawn. And just damage your ability to, have that nice perfect pawn center in the middle of the board. So we do see knight to G6. We have bishop to E3. We got queen to C7. So bishop back to E2. This might look like it wastes a move, but this is a very common retreating move in a Sicilian. You're also trying to make sure that you defend against these diagonals here with that bishop. So you don't always want to give it up, especially in a situation where if you do give up the bishop, you're just going to take back with the D pawn, and you're going to have a lot of open lines for your bishops. Not that last arrow, but it's not gonna be a legitimate trade. A lot of times when you pin a knight, you're wanting to try to damage their structure to make the end game be harder to play. But that's not going to be the case here because the C pawn is gone. So we see bishop to E7. We have C4. We got castles. So knight comes to C3. We have B6, and then we have rook to C1. And actually a very strong continuation that Wesley So actually missed. If we back up here, was knight D to B5. A lot of the times when you're playing Sicilians, you'll see the A6 move. And that is the reason why you'll see A6 a lot of the times is because of this move right here. So for a lot of you guys that out there that do play the Sicilians, this should look very this knight B5, either this one or this one, it should have jumped out at you as a possibility. It's giving a pretty strong advantage. It's not very clear why there is such a big advantage, but that's pretty much for the computer to know and for us to not know. But one line could be queen coming back to B8. We'd have queen to D2. We'd have A6, knight coming back to A3, bishop to C5, rook 8 to D1, rook to D8, knight comes back down to C2. We have A5, G3, D6, and then F4. And the one thing I can say without fully knowing exactly why it's so much better for white, just kind of visually looking at it, is the fact that, you know, you have very good control over this D file. You have all of your pieces developed. You know, as you can see with black, you know, they have their pieces kind of, you know, further back on the board, so they don't have as much influence space-wise. So it just kind of looks like a more dominant position for white. So like I said, that's just a possibility, but, you know, I don't know for 100% sure why it's giving such a better advantage compared to what we see in the game. So we see, like I said, we saw rook to c1, knight would take on d4, queen takes d4. We have bishop to b7. We have g3. This is actually the novelty of the game. This is the first time this has ever been seen. I mean, the intent seems pretty clear. I mean, you're wanting to push, get rid of that. You're wanting to push f4. So g3 just perfectly. Not only does it take away these squares for the knight, because the knight is kind of oddly placed for black, but it does very legitimately prepare f4 to come. So we see bishop to f6, trying to knock that off a little bit. So we see queen coming back to d3. We have bishop takes c3, rook takes c3, and we see f5. So, you know, black is trying to get their own counterattack in. And the one thing I can say about the position that we see now, comparing this position that we see to the position that we saw before, where it looked like black was a lot more passive, it does look like black is on the attack right here. And they're not playing passively at all. So we see pawn takes f5, rook takes f5, we see f3. And already you're starting to see some concessions from white because f3 is not what you really want to play. And it is very heavily attacked. You got this bishop coming down, the rook is coming down, and as you guys automatically probably know, this rook is going to be coming over here and putting the absolute most pressure on this entire position. So we have rook a to f8 immediately, queen down to d1. We see knight to e5, and as you can see, pretty much every single black piece is trained on this square, and it's falling apart. You know, it's really, you know, Dubov is giving you know, Wesley a run for his money with this position here. And so we see bishop to d4, we see g5, queen come to d2, g4, we see f4, and then we see queen to c6. And this is something that you never want to see. You know, when I'm playing games online and stuff like that, this is like the most nightmare situation that you see. Is this queen and this bishop bearing down on like a very huge weakness as far as like, you know, these light squares and stuff around the king. So it pretty much forces king to f2. Yeah, it's a pretty nightmare situation when the diagonal is completely open to where this king can possibly be checkmated. It's never nice to see. So we do, like I said, we do see king to f2, knight coming back to g6, which does allow a pawn to be grabbed, but it's not so bad for black. So we push e5, bishop takes f5, pawn takes d4. We see queen takes d4. We see rook takes f5. And then just to play through a couple more moves, we see rook to e3, rook to c5, and then we see b3. Now, as you can see, like obviously from looking at it, you have 3 pieces for white and you have 4 pieces for black. And so if you do a pawn count, we see 6 pawns for white and we see 4 for black. So as crazy as it sounds, black does have the initiative and black is doing better. But white definitely has compensation for the piece that they gave up. Because not only do they have the rook pair, they do have 2 extra pawns. You know, so it's very even. You know, it's a pretty big imbalance, but you know, it's not like white is not doing good in this position. They're actually doing pretty well. And so we see b5 trying to chip away at some of these pawns that white has established here. We see rook to e8, king to f7. We see rook to d8. We see knight to f8, just protecting this pawn here. So rook to d8 doesn't fully work. And so we see rook back to b8. We have knight to e6. We see queen to d3 and rook to h5. And as you can see, black is doing very well. Even though white does have compensation for, you know, the piece being gone, they are getting very thoroughly, you know, picked at as far as their weaknesses go. So black is actually pretty thoroughly winning this position right here. And it's basically Dubov's game to lose at this point. And so we see h4, and so you can see that for the past maybe 10 moves, you know, white has had to make concessions almost all the time. You know, they've had to push pawns that they really wouldn't like to push. They've had to move their king, and then they are down a piece. So it's if Dubov doesn't give Wesley So the game, Dubov really can just kind of coast home with this one. So we see pawn takes c4, pawn takes c4. We got queen to c7. And then we pretty much have the only move by white is rook to h8, which is a nice little, it's kind of cheeky. I mean, it's possible that you can take here, and then after takes, and you have at least a pawn back. So you're getting some of your material back. But we see queen to c6, or queen to b6 with check. So the king comes down to e1. We have knight to c5, just getting the knight in a better position. We see queen to e2. We have queen to a5 with check. We have king to f2. We have knight to e4 with check, and we have king to g1. And then so we actually see queen to b6 with check again. And so you see that that black has improved their knight's position. And then they have their queen going, their bishop is coming, their rook is going to be getting into the game. So as you can see, I mean, I wouldn't personally want to be white, to be honest with you. And so I wanted to back up here because I did want to stop the video and ask you guys a question. And I wanted to see if anybody can answer this question legitimately and why. So we have the possibility, as you guys can see, after the king is knocked over, that the queen and the rook they do have the ability to be attacked. So why exactly do you think that Dubov does not take on g3 here? The first thing I was thinking about as far as that move is concerned is that you have to worry about a check here. And then after the king moves, you could be picking up the rook. But then I realized that the knight is actually defending the rook in this position. So if we just look at knight takes g3, what is the problem with this particular move? So if you want to stop the video and see what the problem with that particular move is, go ahead real quick. All right, cool. So the problem is something I want you guys to be paying attention to in your own games when you're playing is when you have a king that is completely open in the board. If you were to actually take on g3, that is actually mating. And so you would have something like queen to e8 with check. The king would come down, just one of the variations. The rook would come to f8 with check. The king would go to g7. You'd see queen to e7 with check, king to h6, and you see rook to f6 with checkmate. Another possible variation would be the king would come to g7, and then after queen to f8 with check, the king would come down, and then you would have rook to g8 with mate. So as good as that did look, and I probably would have did that myself if I was playing a quick game. I might have seen this, but you have to be very careful when you're trying to play aggressively or attack when your king is open in the center of the board. So going back to what we had, we did have queen to b6 with check. And then we saw king coming up to h2. The queen came back to g6, you know, just defending against, you know, those possibilities there. And so we see rook to f3, queen to g4. We see rook to e3 because now we're kind of forcing trades because, you know, you can't allow the rook or the knight to hit this square here. So we got queen takes e2, rook takes e2. You got bishop to c6. But unfortunately, rook to f6 was considerably better. Because it was going to allow you to get this knight here in this square and then push the pawn and then move the rook away. And then so you were going to have just a more monster knight. Also, you could have put it back here as well. It would have been something you could have done. So bishop to c6 actually gives quite a bit back in the game. So we see king to h3. We see king to g7. So the rook comes to e8. We have d5. Rook to e7 with check. King to f8. We see rook to c7. So you see that white is just really just trying to, you know, take advantage of any of black's loose pieces here. So we have rook to h6, pawn takes d5, bishop takes d5. We have rook to b2. We have knight to d6. We have rook to b8 with check, and then so we have rook to we have knight to e8 blocking, only move, and then the rook takes a7. And there is a really huge material imbalance here, but as you can see, you do have the rook pair. And you actually have full compensation, and white is doing very crushing in this position. You know, they have 4 pawns to black's 1 pawn, and they have an immobile knight. And this bishop is not really able to influence these rooks as long as you keep them on dark squares. So that's something else I want you guys to be paying attention to as well. Keeping, whenever your opponent has a certain bishop, trying to make sure that you play on the opposite color complex so that you don't run into any pins. Because you definitely don't want to get these rooks pinned, something like that, with this bishop, and then you're going to be losing your advantage. So we see rook to c6. Rook takes h7, so now you can see that white has completely cleared all of black's pawns off the board. So you have bishop to e6 with check. So you have g4. Rook to c3 with check. You have king to h2. Oops. You have bishop to g8 and then rook to h8. You see rook to h3. You see a4. Passed pawns must be pushed. So you have king to g7. You have rook down to h5. Knight to f6. We have rook to g5 with check. We have king to f7. We have a5, bishop to h7, rook to b7 with check, rook to f8, and we have a rook to b6, king to f7. We push pawn to f5, knight to e4. We have a6. Not worrying about any takes here because we're just going to be pushing the pawn here and then getting some checks going. And so we see rook to e2 with check. We have king down to g1. We have knight to d2. And we have rook to b7 with check. We have king to f6. And we go ahead and snap that bishop off the board. We see knight to f3. And we see king to f1. And we see rook to d2. Now, of course, we don't want to take the knight here because the king is connected to this knight, this rook. And after the pawn recaptures with check, you don't have time to save the rook because you're going to have to take here, and then the king is going to be taken. And as you can see, this is a 1000% insanely won endgame. You can even throw this rook away if you want to because these pawns will hold themselves against this king. And then, of course, this one is just too, this one is just 2 squares away from the queening square. So the king is horribly outside that square. And so, backing up here, we did see king to f1, rook to d2. We see rook to h6 with check. This is actually a horrible blunder by Wesley So. This actually allows a draw. And so what we saw in the game was king to e5. But the move here was rook to, king to f7. And then white, really, the only thing white can do is check, continue to check the king. So if we had like, they would have to continue to check the king like this, something like this. Because if they don't, let's say, for example, they were to come down and do, let's see. Yeah, they would have to do that. Bam. Okay. So let's say, for example, you have rook to f7 and you made some type of alternate move. Like, let's say you made a7 trying to make a queen, right? You're going to have the knight checking you. And you are basically forced either to walk back and forth this way or to walk back and forth this way. But you can never go into the corner. So that it's going to be a situation like this. Because if you were to go into the corner, of course, if you were to go, let's say you were to step this way, come back up and go to the corner, that would just be checkmate. So white is actually forced to continue checking the king because if not, it allows at least a draw. So going back to what we had in the game, we did have king to e5. So that threw that draw away. So we see pawn to f6. We see king to f4. We see rook to f5 with check, king to g3. We see rook takes f3 with check, king takes f3. We see king to e1. And as you can see, it is just impossible to win this position. So Daniil Dubov actually does resign. So we get Wesley So gets one of his other wins for the day. So he won 3. He lost 1 and then he drew 1. So that gives him his 3.5. And so like I showed before, I mean, there's just way too many pawns. There's just not a possible way for black to weather that storm. So that is that. I appreciate you guys coming by. Maraming salamat to all my people in the Philippines. Kamusta. Kaibagan. Appreciate you guys watching my videos. And if you guys have anything, go ahead and put it in the comments below. Shoot me some comments. Please hit me with a subscribe. Appreciate it very much. I just need a little bit less than 300 more subscribers and I'm good on my 1,000. So if you have anything else, let me know and I will see you guys next time. I appreciate it.